My name is Neil McMahon. I'm with Alaska Energy Authority, and I'm moderating this. You're here for talk about independent power producers. We have 4 speakers. They'll be working off the same PowerPoint and working through this together. Before we go on, if you would, please turn off your cell phones. And then just other housekeeping. I was asked to remind you that there's a survey for the entire conference. Please do that. That's really great information for the people who put this together. We want to make sure that it's as useful for everyone as possible. If you're doing this for continuing ed, I am the person to sign your paper. There are drawings for pellets, and I guess you can get up to 1,000 pounds of pellets. And then there's another place that you can put in for a drawing in the Yukon room, I believe. There's a meet and greet at CCHRC this evening. So for this thing, we're going to have each of them is going to be giving their own introductions. They'll go over a discussion, an explanation of independent power producers, and then at the end, they'll go over a list of questions, essentially a frequently asked questions section, things that they receive very frequently. And so if they still have not answered questions at the end of things, and you still have things, we'll open up the floor and we'll take the questions then. Just to go over quickly, we have Duff Mitchell, Bob Grimm, Suzanne Gibson, and Doug Johnson. I'm really looking forward to this. I think this will be a really interesting topic, and I hope to learn a whole lot about it. Thanks. You don't want to use that? Yeah, thank you. Who's starting?
Who's starting?
I want you to go first.
Yeah, you're first.
All right, hear me okay? How many of you want to see sustainable energy solutions in rural Alaska? Thank you, so do I. First of all, I want to thank Alan Fetters for the opportunity to participate in this panel today, because I believe that independent power production in Alaska is really part of the landscape. And I'm happy to be here and participate in this panel. Just a little bit about me. If you don't know me, my name is Doug Johnson. I'm the Director of Business Development for Ocean Renewable Power Company here in Alaska and the first Alaskan investor. And as the 4th generation of my family to live here in Alaska, I'm really proud to be bringing new technology to Alaska. And part of what we've been doing with ORPC is just that. Since 2004, ORPC has been pioneering hydrokinetic technologies all over the country. And we've been quite successful in doing that. Probably the most notable success we've had to date is our Cobscook Bay project in Maine. We were the first American company to grid connect and actually sell electrons to as an independent power producer to a utility under a 20-year power purchase agreement. And this project was the project that really started to set our company in motion and allowed us to gain the credibility we needed in the marketplace to attract capital and continue our development. And people noticed. New York Times, Popular Science, Fast Company, and PBS, to name a few. But all this sort of success and all that stuff, that's all great, but what's really important is this. It's home. It's Alaska. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Levi Kilcher for this image. This is some work recently that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has produced, and this is really, really quite a nice slide. It basically says it all, at least for ORPC, why we're in Alaska. 50% of the wave energy resource in America is in Alaska. 90% of the tidal energy resource in America is in Alaska. And a full 17% of the wave energy resource is in Alaska. All those red dots you see on that map are all communities that have power in excess of 50 cents a kilowatt hour. All of that spells opportunity for an independent power producer like ORPC.
Oh, there we go. On the right. Okay. Thank you. My name is Bob Grimm. I'm CEO of Alaska Power and Telephone. We are a public utility and an IPP. We're an investor-owned utility, which there are very few of in Alaska. And our kind of specialty has been on hydroelectric development. We started in Alaska in Skagway in 1957. So we've got over 50 years of providing energy. We've worked hard to invest wisely and get the most effective and efficient equipment as possible to reduce costs. In about 1993, we started developing hydroelectric projects in southeast Alaska to eliminate diesel. And we learned the hard way that the way to do things in Alaska is to do it with local workforce to keep the costs down. And that got us into kind of a niche in the hydroelectric business. We've been very successful. We're about 70% renewable today instead of 95% diesel dependent as we were in '93. Oh, yeah. One of the IPP projects we're working on right now is Reynolds Creek hydropower project. It's under construction. It has a FERC license. It's a joint venture of Alaska Power and Telephone and Haida Corporation, which is a village corporation. The project is located on, that's power plant site. It's located on land owned by Haida Corporation and Sea Alaska. Alaska Power Company is an IPP. Part of the Haida Energy will operate and purchase power and hopefully construct the project. And this will allow all the interconnected portions of Prince of Wales Island to be supplied by hydropower. Right now, we are limited in our hydropower capacity. With this addition of 5 megawatts, we should have several years of excess hydro. Oh, I didn't mean to go on to yours, but I was going to say one other thing. One of the things that we learned early on was that when you did a hydro project and you had to borrow the money to build it, the people that lent you the money actually wanted assurance that they were going to get repaid. We're a regulated utility by the RCA, and so we would get a return on any prudent investment. However, we were betting at the time that oil was going to go up in '93, and that hydro would cross over. Can any of you remember what the price of oil was in 1998? $12 per barrel. And then you have a prudency concern. You're going to say, well, Mr. Commission, I built a hydropower project, but I need to charge more than diesel because diesel has now collapsed. That's a prudency issue. It was very difficult to borrow money under those circumstances. So what we did was essentially create an IPP that we could contract with, and then we could take the IPP contract to the RCA and get it approved and blessed before we built the project, so that we would eliminate the risk associated with prudency review at 2020 hindsight if oil costs continue to decline. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Suzanna Gibson. I'm the Senior Director of Energy Development for SERI. So I started at SERI in about 2009, and for those of you who don't know, SERI is an Alaska Native corporation based in Anchorage, Alaska, and we have diverse business interests in traditional oil and gas, real estate, tourism, and other businesses. But since I started there in 2009, we've really expanded our investments and energy. A lot of you might be aware of the Fire Island Wind Project that we built in 2012. We're also working to develop a second phase of that project, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. In addition to that, we have gone in with some partners in the lower 48, and we own a piece of 6 different wind farms. 2 of those wind farms are in Texas, 2 in Wyoming. We have 1 in Nebraska and 1 in eastern Washington, and the total nameplate capacity on that portfolio is over 650 megawatts. SERI is also a minority owner of the natural gas storage facility on the Kenai. So that project came online in 2012, and we're really proud of that as well because it provides flexibility to electrical utilities and the gas utility in the rail belt. It's the first third-party natural gas storage facility in the region. Prior to working at Chugach, prior to working at SERI, I actually worked at Chugach as an asset manager, and my role there was primarily to negotiate natural gas contracts for them. I moved to the great state of Alaska back in 2005, but prior to that, I was in Houston, Texas, where I was involved in trading natural gas and power, and also in a startup energy hedge fund there. So I'm really excited and proud to work for SERI, and I'm proud of being an independent power producer on the rail belt. We're one of the very first, and we have a happy success story to talk about with the commercialization of the Fire Island Wind Project. It's a 17.6 megawatt project that began operating in 2012, and this slide shows the monthly output of the project. You can see that the project puts out more power in the wintertime when electrical needs are higher and a little bit less in the summertime, which is good because that's when we can go over to Fire Island and perform operations and maintenance on the plant. We estimated, well, this line represents the cumulative production from the project. And this lighter blue line represents the estimated production that we expected. So 2 years running, you can see that what we estimated and what we promised to deliver to Chugach Electric has been very close to what we've actually been able to produce. So the variance in a 2-year period has only been about 1.3% overall, although it does fluctuate from month to month. So I just would be remiss to not thank Chugach Electric for being our customer. It took a lot of courage for them to sign up for a power purchase agreement with an IPP. IPPs are kind of new and not a normal situation in the rail belt, and they did step up and see the value in adding a renewable resource to their portfolio, and so I cannot stand up here and talk about Fire Island Wind without thanking Chugach. With that success behind us, we look forward and wonder, if we can do more, and we think that we can. We are prepared at this time to start construction on phase 2 of the Fire Island Wind Project, which would essentially be a mirror image of phase 1. It would add another 11 GE wind turbines to the island with a nameplate capacity of just over 20 megawatts. That project could generate about 53,000 megawatt hours per year. And we have all of the permits in place. We are in the process of talking to construction contractors about building the project next year. But based on preliminary bids and our preliminary discussions with the rail belt utility, we are offering that power at 6.2 cents per kilowatt. So if we are able to move forward with that, we would have construction next year and complete the project by October. So as one of the only large-scale independent power producers, I feel like it's important for me to opine on the importance of it in the rail belt. A lot of the utilities are looking for additional projects that need to be done in the rail belt, including upgrades to transmission and things like that. IPPs can bring a private source of capital so that they're not always relying on the utility. SERI is interested in offering our assistance where we can, where it makes sense, and it only makes sense if it makes sense for the utility. It's going to save the customers money, and it also is going to create a return for SERI. So it has to be a win-win on both sides. But one of the reasons why it does make sense for a utility to think about engaging with an independent power producer is because it transfers the risk from the utility to the IPP. And that's a situation that SERI is comfortable taking on. We have been successful in developing projects, and we are also continuing to be successful in operating those projects. And it makes sense sometimes for a utility to lay off those risks on another company. And it can facilitate faster development of a new technology. Wind power is not exactly a new technology. It's been around for a long time, but it's certainly a new technology up in Alaska. And sometimes it makes more sense for an independent power producer who can focus on bringing that technology to fruition rather than a utility who has the responsibility of ensuring reliable power every single day. Their plate is pretty full, but it's something that we want to take on. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Hi, I'm Duff Mitchell. I'm the Vice President Business Manager and part owner of Juneau Hydropower. Juneau Hydropower is an independent power producer developer. Our project is the Sweetheart Lake Hydroelectric Facility. There's a picture looking north toward Juneau. I don't know if this has a laser on it, but on the mountainside up there you can see a little gray line. That's the Snettisham transmission line that we will be tying into. Who is Juneau Hydropower? We're a Juneau investor-driven company. Our investors are in Juneau. The project's a 19.8 megawatt, 116,000 megawatt hours project. We have successfully filed a FERC license. Anybody who's ever dealt with FERC and hydropower, it's tedious. We turned in 3,115 pages of everything from avian studies to fish to cultural, hey, name it. It was 26 subcontractors, 3,115 pages, and it was accepted. Our goal is to provide power to the underserved markets in Juneau. A little background on me. I'm also a co-founder and executive director of the Alaska Independent Power Producers Association. Our project, again, there's on the map. It's located south of Juneau. It's about 8 miles from the Snettisham transmission line that's owned by Ada. It currently transmits power from Snettisham and the Lake Dorothy hydropower to Juneau. The project is 100% private. We haven't received nor applied for any federal or state funding. It will produce 50 to 80 direct and indirect jobs in Juneau in the next couple of years. It's a $150 million private investment, and it's going to lower the operating costs for Juneau's mines, Juneau's cruise ships, and provide additional energy for Juneau's future. I'll just sidetrack on the cruise ships. Some of you have heard the emissions issues that EPA has kicked around. When a cruise boat, and we have 1 million cruise passengers come to Southeast Alaska, or when the boats come into port, the local utility, AL&P, kind of pioneered shore-to-ship power. And what they can do is actually run a plug right at the dock, and there's no smoke coming out in any of our Southeast communities. And not only does it reduce the emissions, but it dramatically reduces their operating costs, because the cost of hydropower in many of our Southeast communities is substantially lower than the diesel cost. And I know there's Ketchikan and Skagway and other communities are looking at that as an opportunity to not only help the cruise industry, but also to help develop some of the hydropowers and fully utilize some of the hydropower resources in Southeast Alaska. Now I'm going to move into some of the stuff with the IPP issues. There's gloss slides, and then we'll touch on some of the more frequently asked questions. Again, we formed this organization about 3 years ago. And the Alaska Independent Power Producers Alaska Independent Power Producers Association is comprised of Alaska Native corporations and private Alaska energy developers and operators in Alaska's wind, hydropower, ocean, river, kinetic, and combined heat and power sectors. And you've heard some of the river kinetic and the wind and some of the other hydropower folks speaking earlier. At this time, I'd like to show you just a little video off our website. Well, we threw that in there to make sure no one wasn't sleeping, so. Aside from our advertisement, these are our members. We are growing. We started out with just a couple, and over the last couple of years, we picked up most of the larger independent power producers in the state. We also have many smaller independent power producers that we help and we assist with information and other things. And if there's anyone in the audience that is their particular company or is kicking around or looking at becoming an independent power producer, by all means contact us, and we'll more than willing to help you out where we can. We're a volunteer organization. I'm the executive director. I'm in an unpaid position. But you'll find most of our members are very willing to share knowledge and to help other independent power producers gain traction and develop their businesses. The Alaska Independent Power Producers, you know, we're Alaskan private we're providing Alaska private investment and jobs. We bring in know-how and risk-taking. You heard how Mr. Grimm transferred his organization from diesel-centric to renewable. You have some of the cutting-edge folks that have brought in Arctic wind towers, as well as some of the neat things ORPC's doing about trying to bring new technologies into some of our villages with river hydrokinetics. And so we're working together. We want to help, you know, work with utilities, bring that entrepreneurial spirit, bring in that private capital, help drive down the costs that we all face in our state. You know, these are some technical things of what an IPP is. One of the things under purpose, we're called a qualifying facility. And basically, we're wholesalers. If you look at it from a market point of view, we're a wholesaler developer of power. And our aim is to establish open and fair competition and market opportunities in the Alaska electrical supply industry. I put this slide up here to help differentiate. A lot of people understand the differences, but there's a clear distinction, and Suzanne kind of touched on it. You know, utilities are there to provide reliable power. Make sure you get the power every time you need it. Make sure the distributions work, and make sure you don't have any outages, and make sure there's security in the system. And we're not in that end of the business. Our end of the business is more on the other end, where it's on the generation to try to drive down the price, and so that we can provide the most economical and reasonable price possible. And frankly, our business model is we have to beat the utilities' incremental avoided cost, their cost of power, or we're just taking money out of our pocket and throw it in a fire. So all the risk, 100%, is on our part. Also, in addition, these roles are well defined in the lower 48, and we're in what we call a new era in Alaska where IPPs are starting to develop. So we're facing these in-state challenges that you've talked about and you've heard about. You know, we're having diminishing oil revenues, and and we can continue the style that we have, or maybe we look at it as we can fundamentally change our way of thinking and allow competition and competitive market forces to exist. You know, you go to football games not to see one team. You don't go to a hockey game to only see one team play and get the trophy. What IPP, what independent power producers do is they bring in that competitive spirit into Alaska. We may not always win the trophy, but at least we're making the other team and all the teams a little more competitive, a little more careful on their expenses, because now there's an element of competition in the market. So I'm going to go through some of the Alaska electrical challenges real quick. We'll cover these slides. But we believe that, and we're involved, and you have Alaskan companies involved, that we believe the high cost of electricity is impairing our non-oil economy here in the state. And we want to do something collectively to do something about that. Here's a slide. Alaska ranks second in highest electricity costs in the nation. The one I want you to zero in is our industrial cost of energy. We're 149% higher than the national average. This affects anybody that's trying to do manufacturing, fish processing, and other things in our states. It also robs households of money that could be going to food and other expenses, when sometimes you may be paying a very large share of your cost for heating and electricity. Another thing compounding is that we've had some double-digit rate growth in Alaska. And when you compare us nationally, it's flat. The nation's flat in the rate growth, and we have some of the highest rate growth and inflation in the United States. And then we look at where our non-oil economy is. Mines, half of their cost of operations could be in energy. Some up in this area are around 50%. The ones in Southeast are around 35%. That is a significant cost. Seafood plants, 35% of their cost is in energy. Timber mills, biomass, hotels, lodging, tourism, and our military bases. They all consume voracious amounts of power, and as we increase these costs of power, we become less and less competitive, and it hurts the job creation ability of these industries. So we also have this high cost of electricity. It has some social costs. So I've been talking about the economics. On the social side, you know, some people out there in some of our communities are deciding whether they're going to fill their oil up or pay their electricity bill or eat. And then when you have high cost energy costs and you combine that with a lack of jobs, we have high unemployment and other social impacts. The other thing is I know we see it in Juneau, Anchorage has seen it, and Fairbanks has seen it. We actually have energy refugees. There's families that just can't make it where their grandmother grew up, where their great-grandfather grew up, and they're coming in where that might be a little more affordable. And so this creates a negative downward spiral. We recognize that, and we feel that we need to collectively work together with utilities and with the state to try to do something about this. Challenge number 4, we got more wants than we got cash to pay for. The credit card can only go so far, and we have a lot of needs. And there's more demand on government resources than exists for the next 20 years, just what's on the drawing board. So we just can't simply pretend that we still have this money where we can just throw gobs of money. It was really good in our early parts of the state because we were lacking the infrastructure. And I think everybody will agree we needed to get that prime the pump built, get some of that needed infrastructure. But as we all know from everything we've read in the papers, we're starting to have to rethink that strategy for going forward. Challenge 5. It would look pretty gloomy if we didn't have the resources. I dare say we have a luxury problem in our state. You heard from some of Doug's statistics. You know, we have 40% of the nation's untapped hydropower resource. We have like 90% of the tidal and wave resource. We have 20% of the biomass resource. And you heard what Doug was saying about the wind resource. We are blessed, and for much which is received, much is requested. So this is a man-made problem. We can solve this with everybody here. We have solutions out there. We just need to figure out how to crack that safe with the right variables and get the right cost to develop these resources for our people. Number 6, We're growing, we're IPPs, and we're going to continue to grow, but we rank last in the nation with IPP generation out of all 50 states. As a percentage of IPP generation compared to the total generation, we also rank last in all 50 states. 37.4% of our nation's energy is produced by people that you see at the table, IPPs they're non-utility generators. Now, I threw this slide on here to kind of put things into perspective. China, which has a command economy, 6% of their power is generated by IPPs. Not only is Alaska ranked last in the nation, it's the only state that's ranked lower than China as far as IPP generation. We're out to change that. Now, we have a lot of great state programs. I think our government has invested well with the Renewable Energy Fund, with the Power Project Fund. We championed and helped push through the SETS Fund to try to get loan programs through the state. But most states don't have these programs, and the reason is because they have capital markets ready to come and invest in Nebraska and wind farms. They have private capital firms ready to invest in California's energy, which has a ferociously higher permitting issues than we have, but they can get privately funded. We are last in attracting private capital into developing your village, your local stuff, and so we become dependent on the state government. And so we need to recognize this of what can we do differently. You know, we rank low on most of the metrics, and we believe that it's just not a money and infrastructure issue, that there's a fundamental regulatory and a legislative issue. And what we feel that our analysis is that we're missing the market forces aspect in our state. You know, when you have governmental programs where you can get bailed out or you can always get the money there, you're not necessarily working underneath the model that someone's going to have to pay back the money if we make a mistake. I can guarantee you IPPs, there is no safety net. We invest our own money. If we fail, you won't see some of these people at the table in 3 or 4 years, or they will be working for somebody else. That's how cutthroat it is in the market. And that's that side of the business. The other side of the business is that we can bring in private capital and we can bring in private investment, so it's not competing for state programs as well, where maybe there's places in our state where you must have these programs. Now, some people say, well, competition just adds costs. We're so, we got it squared away here in Alaska. We've heard this from some things. This slide kind of shows where a state and where states have competition, rates have gone down. This is a slide from 1997 to 2013. Where we have competition, you can see where all the negative numbers are. Where we don't, we don't have that downward pressure keeping rates low. Challenge 7, the regulatory process and statutes versus the state energy policy and PERP. But we have a very aggressive state energy policy. It goes out and it says that we're going to streamline government. We're going to encourage the development of our Alaska energy's resources with the private investment and private sector. However, our regulatory and our state legislation and regulations for competitive power are one of the reasons why we're low. We haven't changed our laws since 1982, which was before laptops, cell phones, and the mass adoption of the internet. So we have a man-made problem, an artificial barrier for competition and for IPPs to work in the state. The current state government agencies and process, they say they're for competition with our policy. We're trying to take the next step where they are competition friendly. And so then we go into this directional versus aspirational language. A smart utility lawyer got up in front of the RCA, and the RCA commissioners were saying, but wait a second. The state energy policy says, you know, private enterprise, competition is good. And the attorney made a pretty good argument. He says, well, that's aspirational. So we have a state energy policy that most people sweated hard to get passed through, and Some people feel it's aspirational versus directional, and so that's an issue that we want to correct. Now, we also feel that, and we have RCA dockets going on right now, but Alaska violates PURPA, and I'll get into that in a minute, that requires competition and purchase of the IPP generation at the utility's incremental avoided cost. So what's this PURPA purpose, and where are we maybe not in synchronization with the rest of the country? Section 210 of PURPA, and I'll just go back. PURPA was designed by a senator out of Delaware, a Republican senator out of Delaware underneath the Carter administration. It had bipartisan support, and our country in the 70s had just gone through an oil embargo. And the whole purpose of PURPA was that we get some energy independence where we can allow private enterprise and private know-how to kind of come up to the table, put their risk and their money to help get rid of some of these oil and coal enterprises of utilities. And so that was the basis of PURPA. So, you know, it was designed to promote the development of alternative energy resources by overcoming the historical reluctance of electric utilities to purchase power from non-traditional facilities. This wasn't just new in Alaska, this was going on in the 70s down south. So Congress directs FERC to promulgate rules requiring utilities to offer to purchase electricity from qualifying cogeneration and small production facilities. That's where I was telling you about the qualifying facilities. And FERC rules state that you shall ensure that rates for such purpose shall not discriminate against these qualifying small power producers. Those are the court cases as well as the rules of PURPA. Also, FERC regulations expressly allow qualifying facilities to choose between either provide their energy on an available basis or pursuant to a legally enforceable obligation. In other words, if we come to a utility and we offer a lower cost of power, federal law says you will buy. We want to displace that diesel. We want to displace that higher cost because it's in the ratepayer's best interest to drive those costs down. Where we took a left turn. An APOC 1982 docket effectively stamped out competitive energy development and private capital investments because they said, Alaska, although PURPA is theoretically a nice thing, our utilities are not sophisticated enough to really adopt this. And so it was temporary that we would go into these average avoided costs. And so in the docket, it even said, while marginal cost-based purchase, which is incremental costs, may be theoretically preferable, this approach goes well beyond the current state of rate making for Alaska electric utilities. I dare say those times have changed too. We have great kids coming out of UAF, UAA that can run the computer software programs that can integrate this stuff. I get the same power utility magazines that the utilities do, and I can show you software where you can make it happen, and this excuse is no longer valid anywhere in our country. And so 32 years later, we're still in the same temporary aspect. So here's the crux of it, avoided costs versus incremental avoided costs. We understand that the incremental cost is your last cost that you purchase. So if you are using diesel at 37 cents and somebody comes to you with a hydrokinetic that's at 30, that's beating your last incremental cost. It's not going to beat your hydropower that you might have 5, and it won't displace your hydropower, but what it does is it has you displace your highest cost energy, and so your last incremental cost is always going down as a result of competition and other new technologies coming on. And so in Alaska, what we do is we have average avoided cost instead of incremental avoided cost. And we're the only state that does. So the bridge is forward. You know, we need to recognize that competition is good. Competition makes you wiser, smarter, faster, and better. It also helps lower electrical rates. Recognize that the state energy plan or policy was only the first goal setting step that directs fiscal and regulatory regimes to be more supportive of the private industry. The next step that we feel, and Senator Coghill has a competitive energy bill that's being shared with utilities and anyone else to comment on, to look at, and this will be taken up at this next legislative session. And we want everybody's input because we want to all be in the same canoe rowing forward, which is let's get these costs lower. You saw the slides where we're out of whack. Let's make it happen together, and so we can drive these costs down and make our state more competitive. We also know that most transmission in Alaska has been built by public or state dollars or federal dollars, and that it all should be open access. So if you're a little guy and you want to go sell to a mine, or you want to move from the Kenai and sell power in Fairbanks, that you're not blocked off of transmission, but that it should be open access just like it is in the lower 48. And streamlining red tape and reducing government regulatory costs so that little power producers and even small utilities aren't spending so much money on attorneys just to get the regulatory aspects of their business. Everything that's spent on attorney is one less dollar that could be spent at reducing kilowatts for our public. Now, IPPs can reduce public risk and reduce public expenditures because we're putting our own money on the table. And so we see that as helping spur things forward. So why these issues will not go away? I think we're growing, not shrinking, and we already have other members trying to join our organization, and so you're going to see more and more of IPPs. We got a long ways to go from 4% to the national average. I don't know if we'll ever get to the national average level, but there's a lot of room where IPPs are going to grow. And so Alaskans deserve a regulatory regime that is PURPA compliant, which is basically non-discriminatory. This is competitive and fair and within the spirit of the state energy policy. So really all we're looking for is clean, fair, open, and judicious playing field. And our aim, again, is to establish open, fair competition and market opportunities. So at this time, I want to go into questions and answers. We have some frequently asked questions. And what we can do is we can go through those, and we'll allow the panel to answer them, and then we will Neil will take over, and he can have questions open for our public here that would like to ask some questions of us. So the first question: how does competitive power generation help the consumer ratepayer? So if one of you guys would like to start.
It lowers the cost.
Let me try to expand. You know, I can't sell power to a utility unless I can produce it. Generally, I can't sell it to a utility unless I can produce it at a cost that lowers their costs. And by lowering the cost to the utility, it lowers the cost to the ratepayer. There are some other reasons why a utility might sign up for a PPA, and those include diversity of supply. So it doesn't always come down to dollars. It often comes down to dollars, and it needs to be very close to what the utility could generate on its own. But there are some other considerations. Diversity of supply is one of those. In the rail belt, we're 90% dependent on natural gas, and so it might make sense for a utility to pay a little bit more for a different source of energy to be not so dependent on natural gas. And the other thing that they might be interested in is security of supply, or knowing what that cost is going to be. For instance, when we sold our power from Fire Island to Chugach, they know on day one what the cost of that power is going to be from Fire Island, and on day 365 of year 25 of that power purchase agreement, they know what the cost of energy from that project is going to be. And there is really not any other generation in their portfolio that they can say that about, including the Bradley Lake Hydro project. So it doesn't necessarily always come down to that initial number. There are lots of other considerations to take into account.
Yeah, I'd like to look at this one from a little different perspective, from the smaller communities, rural communities in Alaska. How many of you saw our presentation on what we're doing in Igiugig yesterday? Anybody see that presentation? Thank you. One of the things that we find that's absolutely important is to think of competition in terms of what's happening in the small community from the perspective of competing with the incumbent energy regime. And what we think is important is innovation. These small communities need to innovate, and what we're trying to bring to them is innovation in the sense if they've got the resource there from a perspective of hydrokinetics, let's use it. But sometimes you have to prove it. And what we found is it really takes the communities to step forward and really partner with us to make that happen. You can't come in from the outside and say, this is how we're going to do it. It really takes the community stepping up and saying, we want to do it, and then being there with the right technology and the right people to make it happen.
Well, I think those were really good answers. Next question, why should a utility purchase lower cost power from an IPP?
Yeah.
The utility and IPP has to be the best one.
Well, the way the rules work is that they should purchase it because it's going to be a lower cost, and that's the responsible thing to do because those costs are passed on to the consumers. And it's fairly basic.
What about their arguments of grid stabilization and everything else that goes along with that?
Well, those kind of costs are included in the equation, so it would have to be lower enough to afford those additional costs.
Will a utility lose its state subsidies if it purchases IPP power? I think this relates to some questions we've had confronted with PCE and other things. Would anybody like to take that?
I see no conflict between the PCE program and IPP purchases, so I think it's a non-issue.
I can't really answer the question exactly as it's worded, but we did have a question this morning that maybe this is a good time to address it. Someone was concerned that if a utility purchases IPP power, then that utility won't be able to cover its own base rate costs. So if a utility goes out and builds generation and then it purchases power from an IPP, can that utility still recover the cost of the generation that they built? And the answer to that question is yes, because the IPP is generating power that competes with the variable cost of energy that the utility is producing. So theoretically, that utility stops producing energy from their marginal generation because they can buy it from an IPP at a lower cost, and everybody wins. The sum total is less than it would have been if the utility had generated power off of their marginal unit.
What about the stranded plant costs, stranded investment costs? How do you recover that without increasing rates?
Well, so there's not really any stranded plant costs because the utility is going to use that generation at some point, but the cost of a generator, call it a diesel generator, costs what it costs, right? And the utility needs to be able to recover that. But in order to create power from it, it has to buy diesel to put into it and then generate the power. So they have the plant there, but they don't have to buy the diesel because they're going to buy power from an IPP for less than what it would cost them to buy the diesel and put it through their own plant.
Population centers, PCE is less of an issue or a non-issue. The formula is a little easier because you go in and sell it for less than they can produce it. It doesn't disrupt too much the PCE program, but to a smaller community. And
if I like the question, but yeah, but go ahead and hand him the mic. But try to summarize so it's concise, so we'll be able to visualize what you're trying or understand what you're saying, if you can. And then we'll move on. And if we don't answer it fully, we can come back to you. Okay. Well, here. Yeah, I just need you to restate the question so everyone can hear it.
So one of the challenges with the PCE, for the things we're attempting to do or are in the process of doing, is if we are able to sell electricity to a small utility that has customers benefiting from the PCE for the first, whatever it is, 500 kilowatt hours, the savings doesn't get passed on to the customers. It arguably could get passed on to some of the business customers if the price is low enough and so on and so forth, but ultimately the savings goes back to the state as opposed to the end customer, the end residential customer. And this is the...
So I don't understand if that's a problem. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I think it's a big cost.
You just save the state money by reducing the cost of power.
But it's,
and after 500, let's finish this. After this isn't working. After 500 kilowatt hours,
Right.
that cost is now cheaper
Right.
for whether you're using a kid's computer at home, or you're a coffee shop,
Right.
or you're somebody else in there. And so I'm trying to understand is that maybe it won't go into the pockets of the utility, or it won't necessarily, the utility's still going to get their PCE to lower the cost down to the regulatory rate. So I guess I'm trying to understand.
I guess what it comes down to is the end user, the families who are the customers of the utility in many cases are not going to see an impact themselves. So they're paying after the PCE, for example, 19 cents. An independent power producer comes in, is able to sell the juice at a greatly reduced cost from diesel. That family still pays, in this example, 19 cents. So while the state, to your point, is saving money, and the utility is hopefully in this process saving a little bit of money, the end user is not feeling that benefit. And I think to gain the support for these projects, it needs to go to the end user.
I hear what you're saying. I think I've already answered it. You know, after the 500, you're not going to see much change in the 500, but that utility is now going to be more efficient, and the same PC that utility didn't spend is now available for a community that doesn't have the alternative. Because there is places here where you're not going to have an alternative, and PC is absolutely necessary. But it's in the prudent self-sufficiency of the PC program, and it's also in the best interest of our state to reduce those PC outflows so that we have a perpetual PCE program when oil either goes really, really high and PCE program explodes, or we don't have the revenues to cover it. And so I'll just argue the self-sustainability of the PC program, it is in that consumer's interest, not only directly because after 500 kilowatt hours, they're getting a lower rate, but also, you know, on the long haul of the PCE program.
Let's have that one. Yeah, that's one. Well, we can have how you're going. You don't get support for a project. Well, let's go. We answer the frequently asked questions at the end.
Can you save it to the end?
And we'll
Can you save it to the end? Just so that we can continue.
So
At the end of their questions. Well, we're just trying to, yeah, we're just trying to get through the rest of the questions. Can you save it to the end of the presentation? Okay. Thanks. Yeah, just so we can.
Okay, we will try to answer them faster, because if there's questions out there, we want to take them. Should a utility in Alaska be legally required to buy lower cost power from an IPP than what the utility can generate itself?
Well, we would say yes if we can produce the power at a lower price and then have the same reliability. Why not?
In accordance with federal law, they should already be required to purchase lower cost power.
And that's all we're trying to do, is have the state law follow federal law, which does exactly say that. What happens if an IPP builds a project and it fails?
We're out of business.
The utilities are happy.
I really hope that's not true. But, you know, as an IPP, we put we put the money from our company on the line, and if the project fails or it doesn't run or it doesn't do the things that it's supposed to do, we won't receive the revenue from the project that we expected, and our company will lose money. As an IPP, we take on projects that are potentially a little bit more risky than a normal utility might be interested in taking on. And if a utility were to take on that same project and have trouble with it, have cost overruns, have the project be unavailable and not produce the amount of power that it expects to produce, the costs of the project are still with the utility and they get paid by the ratepayer, period. So that's the difference between an IPP and a utility. We take the risk, we own it, we wear it if we fail. If the utility does it, the ratepayers pay it.
I think that's a good answer. We win or we lose based on the merits of what we produce, not based on a safety net or another program. Are IPPs interested in investing and building projects in rural Alaska?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why we're here.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now see, we're going through these questions fast. How are current Alaska energy regulations different compared to all other states with regards to competitive power from independent power producers?
Well, I believe the biggest issue is probably the average avoided cost versus incremental avoided costs is different in Alaska, which was put in to be temporary. And I was in the business when that rule went in, and it was before computers and that sort of thing, but times have changed now. I think incremental costs can easily be calculated and should apply to the formula.
And that's what we're working on, you'll find unanimity among the IPPs, and we've presented some very strong, compelling things in our docket, R13002, which can lay out all the legal framework of why Alaska is perhaps out of date with PURPA and the rest of the country, and I think our statistics show that. How can we improve our state and attract private investment and resources to develop new energy projects and infrastructure?
Good policy.
Level playing field and open access.
I guess I would echo Bob, a level playing field and open access. You know, we have looked at a couple of projects in the rail belt anyway, and it's difficult because on top of figuring out what the cost of your project needs to be, it's hard to understand what the cost is going to be to move power across the system where there are multiple utilities. It's hard to understand what the cost of integration will be or how it will be calculated and who's calculating it. So, you know, we'd like to do more projects or have the ability to do more projects, but from our perspective, it's difficult to assess whether or not a project is economic and something that a utility would be interested in looking at, because there's a lot of unknowns in the middle between, we have to be certain, and then there's this whole unknown area in the middle, and the utility wants to be certain as well, and that's part of what we offer is like a certain price for 25 years. And there's a lot of variability in what those outcomes could be based on what those calculations are, and we have no control over that and no insight to how it's done.
And we showed a slide where we rank last in private capital investment in energy projects. It'd be really great if some native village corporation or some tribal entity or some rural utility looked at a technology like Ocean Renewable, and they wouldn't have to wait 2 years in line for an AEA grant, but actually there would be banks there to say, hey, this pencils, the rules are fair, the rules are open, we understand them, by golly gee, they're just like everywhere else we invest, whether it's Nebraska or Alabama, and we'll write the check and we'll do it the old-fashioned way and pay the money back because it's economic. And right now, we have banks that aren't going to do it based on our policies.
Suzanne, do you have thoughts on that you'd like to share on how that nebulous could be kind of more clear through standardization or through some sort of process? You probably know with that more than anybody.
Well, I think it's difficult. I think if people try to get down into the nitty-gritty and calculate it down to the gnat's eyelash, they're not going to be able to do it, and they'll spend every day, all day long trying to get there. But the truth is that utilities have integration fees for their own generation, but they don't calculate it. They don't assess their generation a fee. It just gets absorbed by the system. It is a cost of operating a utility. So for instance, down in ERCOT, they don't have integration charges for renewable energy. You sell your power into the grid, and you might have to pay a wheeling fee, but it's a postage stamp rate whether you're going from El Paso to Amarillo or Amarillo to Houston. It doesn't matter. It's the same for everybody. And so the rules of the road are very, very clear, and they're not trying to segment it. They don't waste their time trying to segment it. They just say the same cost applies to every single deal. And it just creates an avenue for independent power producers and utilities to build projects. And you can see it by the explosive growth of generation in Texas.
Yeah, clear rules really facilitate participation.
Maybe grid management, maybe some actual grid, if somebody like bandwidth.
We'll get back, but the answer is yes. We have policies that are old. The world has changed, and we need to update those so that whether you're an IPP trying to move power 100 miles or a utility with excess generation that you're wasting because you can't move it 100 miles and help your ratepayers because you could be fully utilizing your assets, it's really not an IPP or a utility issue. It's just having open access that's clear, fair, everybody knows the rules and they can work. Why is Alaska ranked low in competitive power being generated from independent power producers among all 50 states? We've kind of covered this on some of the things. Does anyone want to answer further? Okay. How can utilities deal with the unpredictable and fluctuating power inherent in wind and other intermittent sources of electricity, primarily from IPPs?
Let's open it up, Duff.
Okay. Do you want to answer? Let's go. Okay. We'll just open it up to questions. Do you want to answer this question first since we get it up here? The fluctuation? Okay. 1.3% was pretty good. Okay. We will now turn it over, since I think we need to get some. We'll get some time in here with some folks. We got plenty of time.
Yeah, we've got half an hour left.
Yeah. So, one question is people ask us, well, why are IPPs good for local ratepayers in Alaska in general? I think through the questions we've answered and through the presentations, at least you can see the viewpoint that we're presenting. I don't want to re-elaborate or re-go into it. I think we offer a plethora of benefits to the state, either by attracting private capital, using technology know-hows, driving costs down so that we can create other industries. So we won't belabor that anymore. And Neil, at this time, I'd like to turn it over to you. I think there was a gentleman there patiently waiting to get the mic.
Thanks.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And we just brought online our little hydro plant. It's a 1 megawatt plant. And that hydro plant will be producing power in 10 years to Matanuska Electric for 3.5 cents. Now, you can't beat that. That's even better than anything else you can get. And it's all private, except for borrowing money from the state. And those are the things in Europe, for example. You go to Austria, and a 1 megawatt of production with small hydro results in a man-year of work. And that's what, every time we bring one of these on, we're bringing on a man-year of work for somebody living in Alaska and spending their money in Alaska. And that's what we can bring to put on the table for everybody.
Actually, if you could also introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Earl Osmond, and I've been around for quite a long time.
How hard was it for you to sell your power to Madagascar Electric? How much did they resist that?
Well, we had to pull a few strings. And fortunately, Joe Griffith helped us out, and also the board helped us out. If they hadn't have, we would have never made it. And that's one of the problems. And it has always been one of the problems. And this goes for any renewable energy. And we'll be around when the coal is all burnt and the gas is gone.
So the utility leadership helped make it happen.
Pardon?
The utility leadership helped make it happen.
That's right. That's right.
At 3.5 cents.
3.5 cents. Well, right now it's 7, but in 10 years it's 3.5 cents. You can't beat it. Bradley isn't going to do it either.
You've all talked about private sector bringing in capital and generation. We've got difficulties with transmission. Do you see a role for private sector capital coming in to helping with transmission?
I'll take this a little bit. Our IPP group isn't really pro-Transco or pro-ISO. We've listened, and we think that there needs to be a fix there. The reason why we like private being involved is that the costs tend to be lower. I dare say that we don't have the same regulatory processes for bidding. We can sometimes get it done cheaper, faster, smarter, because usually in the private side you got to pay it back. So you got to watch those costs really closely. And so in the big picture, I would say yes, I think there needs to be some private enterprise involved with the transmission. Now that doesn't mean we just hand over all of our assets. There has to be obviously the regulatory controls, but that for-profit motivation sometimes cuts costs. You don't have a CEO making $400,000 running your transmission. You may only be paying him a fourth of that, and it may actually be cheaper in the long run by having private enterprise involved. And so, you know, the devil's in the details, but I think it's a good thing.
Just to respond to your question, Gene, Siri is definitely interested in competing to construct and own transmission. We don't need to operate it, but we definitely have capital that we would be willing to deploy in that sector, and we would be willing to earn a regulated rate of return for it. I think that we have proven our ability to do that in constructing our 12-mile transmission line that runs from Fire Island to Chugach and across the Cook Inlet. That was a big project. It took a lot of logistics and planning, and we brought it in on budget and on schedule. And we feel like we can be helpful in the rail belt by, you know, being willing to take on those types of projects. And so I definitely think competition is good, because we're going to compete on a price basis to bring the project on, and then we're going to take the development and construction risk. Or we would if we were allowed to. We would like that opportunity.
You don't want to tell them how your private line from Skagway and Haines was done for, how many miles was that, Bob? 16 miles for $8 million?
16 nautical miles for $7 million, but that was a long time ago.
Still a long time ago, but I tell you what, I don't see any governmental agency or utility being able to beat 16 nautical miles of submarine cable for $7 million, even in those years' dollars. So Neil, any other questions?
Other questions?
Okay, Dorothy Shockley. I have a couple of comments. One is, you know, when the gentleman was talking about the consumer not getting a pay cut in regards to if the utility gets an IPP or not. in a very small community, let's say 100 people, you may get your fuel in once a year. So you have that fixed cost. So that in itself has to be repaid. So regardless sometimes whether you have, an IPP or any other kind of utility cut, that money is still, you still have that fixed cost that has to be repaid. So the consumer, regardless, I think, sometimes has to pay that. So, and we see that in a lot of our small communities. And, I agree with the gentleman, or a few people, that, I worked in Juneau for 8 years for a state senator. So for years, we've been getting the pushback from the utility companies because they, that's their bread and butter. They don't want to give cheaper rates and buy cheaper power. So, somehow we need to change those policies as well.
Did you have a question in there as well, or comment?
Well, if they have an answer.
Well, I can just say, that IPPs aren't a solution for each and every community. It's really tough when you're in a community of 100 people and trying to lower those rates. But if you had a couple small, let's say wind was an option in a community, if you had a couple small windmills, the displacement of that diesel, even though it stayed in the tank maybe one more year, it may be cheaper this year than it is next year. And I know you outlaid that money, and that's a tough thing because that money still needs to get paid. But what we want to do is if we can decrease that diesel, and I'll tell you, in Juneau, oil, since we filed our project in 2009, oil prices in Juneau has gone up 44%. And we're in Southeast and more of an urban community. And I can only imagine what that fuel inflation has done in some of our more rural areas. And so, I certainly don't want to propose that we are the answer to all issues, but you raise some very good comments. I appreciate it.
My name is Mike Kraft, and I own the Delta Wind Farm, and I'd like to touch on something that Suzanne was talking about earlier, and that has to do with how do you cover these base load costs, and when we compete against the fuel cost, okay? Strictly the fuel cost. And I don't know if, how many of you guys live in Fairbanks, but here in Fairbanks, we have an energy surcharge on our bill, okay? That's because we don't know how much oil is going to go up in a quarter. So they get to look back and say, well, we think it's going to go up this much, so there's an energy surcharge on top of the bill. So there's a base rate that includes all of their overhead. They go through the RCA, file that base rate based on what their overhead is. That includes all of the interest and principal on any new generation they've developed. It includes all of the payroll, the insurances, all of their infrastructure, all their telephone poles. All of that solid base is in the base rate. When you come online as an IPP, you only get to compete against their avoided fuel cost. So that doesn't change their ability to pay for their infrastructure. What they end up doing is getting cheaper power. And I'm sorry, but that gets passed on to the consumer. And that's how that works. We're not taking away the utility's ability to collect their base rate. And for example, the $1 billion worth of capacity that was just built in Anchorage, it's getting included in your base rate in Anchorage. It's getting ready to go up by 40%. That rate's not going to change. They get to collect that no matter where they get their power from, or no matter how much their fuel costs. So I want to be clear that we're not out to hurt utilities. We're out to save consumers money, and that comes down to avoided fuel cost.
My name is Pilar Thomas. I'm at the Department of Energy, and I was talking yesterday about the need to attract private investment, and IPPs are one of the ways that we do that. I agree 100% that we're not going to see more deployment in rural Alaska villages at the rate we're going with federal and state funding. It'll take us 1,000 years to get the renewable energy generation in based on just how much installed cost it would take to put enough wind and solar and biomass and geothermal and hydropower. So, well, 1,000 years might be a bit much, but it's a very long time. It's generations. So the question becomes not so much how do we leverage IPPs in the appropriate place where they can make money, where the village utility and the ratepayers will save money, because those villages are all over the state, and we have to try and identify where that opportunity is. And that's part of what we do when we work with utilities and we work with the state and we work with tribes is where can we identify those opportunities. It's also important, though, I think, for us to think about the law of unintended consequences, because it always exists. And Alaska is a little behind the times in terms of IPP penetration, if you will, into the market. But it's also true that the lower 48 was once like Alaska, where you had vertically integrated utilities, which owned all their generation. And they themselves started divesting themselves. I lived in California when all the California utilities started divesting themselves of their generation and started then buying their power from IPPs. And there was some lessons learned there. And I think I would caution as we're looking at where this real opportunity is, and it exists, and it's a good way to save money, but there will be some unintended consequences. Part of it is in the PCE impact. Part of it will be in the technology impact. And part of it will be in the stranded cost and how do we deal with kind of our own anachronistic accounting measures that we have sometimes. So, you know, we're happy to provide analysis, support, technical assistance to any village that's trying to look at whether an IPP makes sense to them. If they think it's an opportunity to build a project that you don't have to invest in, that you can get somebody else to take the risk on, and provide technical assistance in that analysis, try and understand what some of the unintended consequences are, and then try and mitigate them, because they will happen. And we're happy to also show, you know, what happened in the lower 48 as utilities were divesting themselves and avoiding some of those same mistakes or same challenges and mitigating that way. But I do think that this is a tool that is incredibly underutilized. It is a way for not only folks like Siri to make money, but other native corporations, other regional corporations. It's a job creator. It's both in construction and in operations. It's certainly a technology forcing opportunity. We're going to get more deployment faster when we bring other people's money to the table. And I think we would all agree that the more free wind and free sun that we can put out there to reduce our costs in the villages, the better off the villages are. And we just have to figure out how to mitigate some of the counter incentives, disincentives, and make sure that we have a transition that makes sense. But we're happy to help. So anybody have any questions about at least what we can do, you know, feel free to ask us. And I want to, you know, thank the panel. I think it's important for us to be having these conversations because it's how we start thinking outside the box in different ways to pay for these projects and to get them built. So thank you for the panel.
A comment and two questions, a softball and a hardball. The comment, I installed 7 miles underground cable, 3-phase, for $2.3 million, so that's pretty good in 2007 and crossing 7 rivers. But common ground, the federal tax subsidies for wind and solar, are you working at all towards some kind of tax credit for taxable entities for hydropower to kind of get the playing field a little more balanced there? Because that's a big resource in a lot of the state. And the second question is, there's a lot of emphasis on cost, and our utility members, I'm Clay Copeland, Cordova Electric Cooperatives Manager. Our members, cost is, in many cases, not the most important part of the balanced scorecard they look at. Reliability is very high in their concerns. So I'll just throw out a scenario. If, say, an IPP comes into a utility, provides a power purchase agreement, builds and starts operating a power plant, the utility is forced to buy the cheaper power. They lay off their operators, diesel plant operators, they move somewhere else. And then the IPP folds and the lights go out. Who runs that plant?
Well, that's an interesting scenario. First of all, an IPP is there to lower your costs, and you know that would be.
They're in the community or they're in another state?
Say again.
They're in the community?
The IPP would obviously be there if they're producing power locally, but part of that integration and that power purchase agreement that you have with the IPP underneath PURPA, it says you will buy at the lowest at the your incremental avoided cost or a mutually agreed rate. And when that mutually agreed rate is Clay, you're a smart guy, and you'd probably sit down there and say, hey, if I got this scenario and you go TU or whatever, I'm sure you will have those arrangements in your contractual arrangement with the power purchase agreement. Because, I mean, you know, that is a perhaps an issue that, you know, maybe you would be fearful of. But, I mean, these folks have put together power purchase agreements, and, you know, if the Surrey wind farm quits blowing wind, there's a mechanism for that backup to occur. And, you know, I don't think anybody's just going to fold and leave their asset there after they put millions of dollars into it and says it doesn't work. That's the risk that we take as a private investor, and we have to prove that to you as a utility. So when it comes to providing you not only the low power, you know, if you want to play hardball and say, I don't want to buy it from you, then the federal government and the rules of the law of the land says you must purchase it or a mutually agreed upon rate. And in that mutually agreed upon portion is where, you know, you need to have your negotiating team to say, hey, if this, we do have concerns about your viability, or we do have concerns about your technology, or whatever it might be. I mean, that's where you pull out your negotiating team. But most intermittent, I mean, if you had a hydropower competitor come into your community and could beat your power, yeah, you might be prudent to lay off your backup power. But if it's maybe an intermittent source, you know, you may not want to. But I will tell you, even with hydropower, you have avalanches on transmission lines, and so, you know, you're right. Reliability is a big concern with utilities. But I will flip the telescope around the other direction. That's your duty as a certificated monopoly. That's why you have that certificate. Remember where we talk about the IPP role versus the utility role. It is your job to establish that reliability. It is our job to provide you the lowest cost power. Otherwise, we're not in business. So I don't know if that's the answer you want, but you know, that's the answer that I can provide you based on the scenario that you put forward. And I do think running for $2.7 million that many miles underground and under those number of rivers, that's a good job.
Hi, I'm Jody Mitchell, and I work for IPEC. Spoke this morning. We installed 65 miles of underground line for $10 million back in 1993. So I think we did a pretty good job there. I guess my point is the utilities do a good job, and I kind of hear a lot of utility bashing here. I don't make $400,000 a year, that's for sure. In fact, I'm probably one of the lower paid general managers in the state, but that's not my complaint. One thing that you're not mentioning here is that Alaska also has, what was it? I heard a statistic recently about how many microgrids we have in Alaska. We have like 18% of the world's microgrids here in Alaska. We're not all strung together like they are down the lower 48. So IPPs don't have as big a role here for a very obvious reason. We're not all strung together. It's not that easy for an IPP to develop a project and sell power on our system because we're not all connected. So that makes a big difference, and that's something that you haven't mentioned here. I think it's worth mentioning.
Does anybody else have any
I just answer that 90 or 80% of our population is on a connected grid. But Jody's right, there is a lot of microgrids. And I don't think we have any illusion that an IPP will work in each and every community. But we will say that the regulation has to allow an IPP to exist and an IPP to prosper and have the opportunity to have the fair playing field. So where those utilities can benefit from IPP generation, that IPPs, you know, should be encouraged. Our state energy policy says it. It's clear that our rules have not kept up with the realities of our market or the realities of our state. And frankly, we just don't have the money to ignore private enterprise coming in and willing to put their hard money to work for the citizens of our state. That's why you see IPPs starting to flourish. But at any rate.
Well, I would disagree. There is definitely a mechanism for you guys to sell power on our systems. But maybe not a small system like mine, but in the rail belt there is, and there are IPPs existing now. So I don't agree with you on a lot of what you've said here. One thing I wonder though is what kind of rate of return would you be expecting to do what you do? As a regulated utility, IPEC only earns about 4% per year, if that. I mean, we're talking pennies. So I'm interested, I understand that most regulated utilities, IPPs anyway, get up to 12 or 13%. You know, that all, of course, is paid for by the customer. So what kind of rate of return would you get? I mean, I'm curious to know how much you're getting on the systems that you have now. I mean, Duff, do you have a system right now that you're selling power on?
Okay. Well, I'll take a crack at it. I have watched a lot of filings at the Regulatory Commission by regulated utilities who are asking for a 12% rate of return. I can tell you that Siri's rate of return on the Fire Island Wind project is much closer to what you're earning than what those regulated utilities are asking for. We're not even in the same ballpark.
And Jody, on our first project in Maine that we negotiated the power purchase agreement with Bangor Hydro, which is now Emera, owned by Emera, we were in a highly incentivized market, so we were getting about 26 cents a kilowatt hour, which was giving us a rate of return in the around 10%.
Yeah, I think it really varies upon the cost of the capital of the IPP. You know, the return is a healthy margin is going to be required by the lender, just like our US requires you guys to have a margin. And so it's kind of hard to say it's one thing, but you know, the regulated cost of equity or cost on a rate of return basis in this state is around 10% on the rate base, combined equity and debt.
And that's where we're going to leave it. It's 5 o'clock now.
Great. Well, Neil, we want to thank you for and AEA for putting this forward to forum. I hope you all found the IPP perspective useful, and we plan on working together, moving ourselves forward and lowering the cost of power for Alaskans across the state. Thank you very much.